but we can change that government, we can change that policy. But if we have already conceded the veto, we can have pressure coming back from Europe in a new government or for against a new government to force them to move in a further direction with our health services, opening them up to privatisation. And removing that veto means removes a weapon that people power could invoke to force a government not to allow obnoxious proposals to be imposed in our health services and education and social services in the ones that they now propose to try and open up over the next period of time.
You're saying that the treaty potentially closes down the policy space, that this government is certainly not interested in exploiting, but perhaps a future more left-wing government in Ireland could conceivably want to. That Lisbon actually reduces the options that a future government might have to have control over its public services.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a key point that we have tried to emphasise in this campaign. Now, unfortunately, our present government in Ireland has given contracts in the last 2 years, not just to private corporations in the health service, but to corporations which in the United States, for example, have been shown to be absolute fraudsters. They have been fined hundreds of millions of dollars for fraud within the medical services, Medicare and so on, in the United States. But should we throw our hands in the air then and say, well, they're doing it already, to make a change in Lisbon makes no difference? And we say it would be a big mistake to take that viewpoint, because as you indicate, we can change this government, we can kick it out and elect a new government. And even if that government wasn't necessarily left-wing government, but we could put pressure on it in any case to change policy. But what European governments have done and tend to do, like the Irish government, is to use the excuse of European law to say we can't do anything, we have to do this, we have to allow the multinationals in, we have to open up our public services because Europe says so. Europe says so because they now propose to give Europe the right to say so. So we say that shouldn't happen.
What do you say to some people, including people on the left, who say, listen, it's time to have these arguments at the European level. We should be strong enough in our politics to say, let's have the arguments about privatization, let's have the arguments about democracy and militarization in those European institutions, some of which, like the Parliament, are arguably strengthened by the Lisbon Treaty.
Oh no, in the European institutions, let's be clear, the argument for proper public services, for real democracy, for any kind of a left-wing or socialist ideas will not get a hearing. At the present time, Europe, unfortunately, is dominated by right-wing governments.
Well, at the present time, but perhaps...
Yes, but I mean, we don't really know when the situation will change politically, that we will have more left governments or proper socialist governments. But at the present time, they are dominated by right-wing governments, so they are already predisposed to listen to the major corporations and to give them their ways, quite frankly. So we have to try and maintain the power of working people to wield as much influence and strength as they can. And that's not just for Ireland. We're not saying this as nationalists. We are not nationalists, in fact. We're internationalists. We want the French workers and the German and the Polish workers to have those rights, those democratic rights for themselves. And I've seen that certainly as an important plank in the opposition to the Lisbon Treaty.
Now, Joe, in Ireland, a lot of the argument about militarization of the EU has come down to this question of, is Irish neutrality protected? But I think you see it in a larger context than that, what Lisbon means in terms of the growing militarization of the European Union.
Absolutely. Now, Lisbon provides very clearly and mandates that extra military capabilities must be provided for within the European Union. That's number one. Number two, for the first time, it gives an official standing to what is called the European Defence Agency. And the European Defence Agency essentially is a body that coordinates the armaments industry of the European Union. For the first time, that is enshrined in a treaty. And the treaty mandates more research and more technological resources for that. So, in other words, an intensification of the armaments industry. Now we see the armaments industry both in Europe and in the United States or wherever else as an obscene wastage of resources. In the European Union, perhaps in dollar terms, $90 billion a year wasted in resources, and then these armaments are sold to countries like Pakistan and India, where the masses starve virtually, but in the interest of the elite, and to make huge profits for the European armaments merchants. Now, we think it is shameful, frankly, that any Irish group or political people in Ireland would call on Irish people to endorse that kind of a further thrust. And essentially, what this is about is equipping the European Union with a foreign policy and a military policy and an army that can go onto the world stage and rival the United States or other major powers.
Some people looking at this might say, wouldn't that be a good thing, given the way the United States has built its army?
Unfortunately, those arguments have even come out here in Ireland in the debate. Isn't it a good thing that you would have a counter block to what George Bush has created? But the logic of that really is that we are creating a new arms race after the Cold War has finished. And what we would pose instead, both in the United States, in Europe and everywhere else, that the massive, incredible resources that are devoted to weapons of mass destruction would be that those resources would be used instead to resolve the problems of humanity. For the hundreds of millions of people who have no clean drinking water, let's resolve that. Environmental issues and other problems. And it's be directing the resources there that we remove what are the causes of conflict, of terrorism, etc. That's how we have real peace. But if we take this other road of an intensification of armaments and militarization, and then we have the EU jockeying with the United States for markets and raw materials in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and so forth. I mean, that brings us back, frankly, to the pre-World War I situation, when you had huge powers, imperial powers like Germany and Britain and Russia, Japan, vying with each other for markets and raw materials, and it finished up in the incredible savagery of the First World War. That's not how we achieve peace in our world. So, whereas it is true that Ireland can say, oh, we're neutral and we don't have to send troops to a conflict situation if the European Union was involved in such, it's not good enough to say we'd stay in our garden and let them at it. We have a responsibility to try and stop this whole development within the European Union and within the world, in fact, just like people, tens of millions of people all over the world, from America right across, marched against the Iraq War. We have such a responsibility with regard to world issues of militarization, armaments, and world peace as well.